The final ordinance of entitlement as a Jew is a mitzvah or commandment of kavod hamet, honoring the dead. And today we are assembled to honor an icon of the Tri-Cities Jewish community, Doris Lewis, and indeed of the greater community as well. Traditional Jewish burial practice includes customs that are in many cases millennia old. Prior to interment, the body is prepared by washing and dressing. Washing and dressing in simple shrouds, and placed along with some earth from Jerusalem in a plain and simple wooden casket devoid of all metal or plastic or other materials that do not decay along with the body. And that's in keeping with Genesis 3:19, which says, God says to Adam, "Earth you are, and to earth you will return." The simple and succinct burial service typically consists of readings from the Psalms and a brief eulogy, along with the recitation of two requisite prayers. Burial is effected as soon as practicable after death, sometimes as early as the day of death, but can be delayed because of the Sabbath or the high holy days, or sometimes for other holidays, or for other legal or pragmatic secular reasons prescribed by law. And that can include the arrival of a distant relative. There is no viewing of the body, which is carried to the grave by persons honored as pallbearers. 7 times on the way to the grave, the pallbearers will halt, symbolically indicative of their desire not to part with the decedent. Finally, the simple wooden casket, adorned only with a plain wooden Star of David, is covered with earth by the family and friends. And the second part of this service will be at the gravesite. While there are a number of rules and customs that govern the burial process as a whole, the service is not rigidly stylized or formalized by Jewish law, and customs vary from place to place, even among different congregations and the different denominations of Judaism. For those that are not familiar with Judaism, like Christianity, Jews have different denominations. And like Christianity, the different denominations have different customs, and even different customs within them by individual synagogues. Thus, in the United States, there's a lot of variability in contemporary Jewish funeral services, reflective of the traditions and wishes of the family, the congregation, the officiate, and the ethnic branch. All are typically specific to the memory of the deceased and in keeping with long-standing tradition, inclusive of customs to facilitate separation and ease the sadness of those living loved ones, as well as to honor the decedent. Typically included are only 2 prayers: the El Mole Rachamim, which will be presented in both English and chanted in Hebrew, and the Mourner's Kaddish, which will be recited at the end of the service. These are the only religious requirements. Today we follow the traditions and recall, in keeping with Jewish belief, that we have a body that functions from birth until death, and a soul that existed before our birth and continues after our death. Expanding on this theme in Ecclesiastes 12:7, King Solomon observed, "The earth returns to the land as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it." Thus may the spirit of Doris Lewis be bound up in eternal peace, and may her loved ones be comforted by the conduct of her life, a life consistent with the teachings, ideals, and ethics of Judaism. Ecclesiastes 3 has a beautiful psalm which really describes everything. A season is set for everything, and a time for every experience under heaven. A time for being born and a time for dying. A time for planting and a time for the harvest. A time for tearing down and a time for building up. A time for weeping and a time for laughing. A time for wailing and a time for dancing. a time for throwing stones and a time for gathering stones, a time for embracing and a time for shunning embracing, a time for seeking and a time for losing, a time for keeping and a time for discarding, a time for ripping and a time for sowing, a time for silence and a time for speaking, a time for loving and a time for hating, a time for war and a time for peace. Proverbs 31:10 describes Doris far better than I, and I think is a wonderful tribute to her. A woman of valor, who can find, for her price is far above rubies. The heart of her husband safely trusts in her, and he suffers no lack of gain. She does him good and not evil all the days of her life. She gives food to her household and a portion to her maidens. She stretches out her hand to the poor. Yea, she stretches out forth her hands to the needy. Strength and dignity are her clothing, and she laughs at the time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the law of kindness is on her tongue. She looks well to the ways of her household, and eats not the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. Many daughters have done valiantly, but thou exceed them all. Grace is deceitful, and beauty is vain, but a woman that reveres the Lord shall be praised. Give her of the fruit of her hands, and let her works praise her in the gates. And I think that is a very apt description of Doris, who I had the pleasure of knowing for, without revealing too much about my age too here, more than 50 years. I'm going to ask her children, Jerry and Miriam, to give the eulogy. Jerry, I think you were going to lead off here.
Thanks, Ron. So thank you all for coming. I'm not totally sure I can get through this, although I did this a practice run, and there's one story in here that I have never gotten through without choking up, and I did, so we'll see. And it's hard to really anticipate, when it's going to strike you. It's hard to believe that Mom is gone. She was like the Energizer Bunny or the Timex watch. She took a lickin' and kept on tickin'. It was a long, good run, but it finally came to an abrupt end. Though not so abrupt, as this year she had more troubles than any in the past. But until the pneumonia, she bounced back right away. And even then, she seemed to be improving recently. People were visiting her in the hospital, and she was in good spirits, and she was ready to go home. I'm not sure she knew exactly what home was, but she was ready. And she had a stroke a few months ago and was walking and talking within a few days. She's fallen and hit her head more times than anyone can count, going back a dozen years at least. After she passed, she looked at such rest, and much like she did when she was sleeping. You could imagine her opening her eyes and saying she wasn't sleeping, she was just resting, as she's done hundreds of times before. But alas, it wasn't to be. Before I go further, I'd like to thank everyone who has helped and lent Mom support, not just in these last days, but all along. I no doubt will leave many people out, and for that, I do apologize. First, I'd like to thank Dick and Sue English. Really, more than anyone, they have supported and connected with Mom in nearly weekly visits since she moved into Bonaventure, as well as in the hospital. These were continuations of visits that Dick and Mom had usually on Sundays, in her old house where they often shared conversation and ice cream, or their Taco Bell feasts, always with a senior mist. Mom had to have a senior mist, and I forget what else. Leslie Cohn has also been right there in times of need in a spirit of Bickerholm and general Menschkeit, as well as visiting and organizing visits to Mom in Bonaventure. She's especially been there and been beyond helpful in Mom's hospital visits and in the last few days, as well as dropping everything and coming to be with Mom when things went south on her last day. She stayed with us and after us until everything was done. I really, really can't thank her enough. Many visited her in the hospital and rehab, including Jim and Doris Kelly, Phoebe, Debbie, Janine, and really just lots of others. Many of you here. So I'm sorry I can't. This would run 50 minutes if I thanked everybody. And I don't think Ron mentioned it, but I thank the Chevra Kadisha. The Chevra Kadisha is a ritual group that does a mitzvah that can never be repaid in preparing the deceased and helping them usher them out of this life. Out of this world, sorry. Thanks also to those who've expressed their concerns and connection to Mom near and far, in particular the Blooms from Portland, Merle Minda and Nancy Paull, her nieces, and others from the family. Phil Goldsmith has been, who always visited Mom when he was in town, and Tammy Schendel, who was special to Mom, and vice versa. And again, really just many, many others. Just think, reflecting on this, it's just the amount of love for Mom and the amount of people that cared about her really comes to fore. Through Facebook in particular, Mom has a network of admirers, both known to her and not. Facebook and computers in general didn't make much sense to her, but she was known and loved. She never really quite figured out, how do people know this stuff, Where do they get all these pictures of us? She typically characterized the love and admiration in her later years with a wave of the hand. You've probably all seen it. She's dismissing something, as she was not a fan of such praise and probably had unwarranted feelings of inadequacy. There are probably many such instances that we don't know about, but I hear stories about how she was like a grandmother to one, offered kind words to another, and had strong bonds with many, many people in the community, including Bonnie Goldsmith, Paula Garland, Susan Catherine. Mom was a strong woman, no doubt about it. She was forged by fire, both metaphorically and in reality. She was born in Duluth, Minnesota, to Nathan Mickle, who everyone called Mike, and Minnie Polinsky on April 10th, 1914, nearly 106 years ago. 106 years ago. It's amazing. It was a hard-scrabble existence for her family, a part of the poor Polinskys. There were two families in Polinsky families in Duluth, the poor Polinskys and the rich Polinskys. So this is the lore, family lore anyway. Both her parents came from the Ukraine. Her mom was born in Kiev and raised by an aunt who was well off, and she had many advantages. Mike was reputed to be pretty handy and capable. In pictures, you see his hands were big and he looked strong. Unfortunately, he came down with tuberculosis. He went to a sanatorium and may have been improving. I was discussing this with Miriam. We have kind of different interpretations of this story. But what I heard is that his family urged him to come back and take care of his wife and kids, mom and her older brother. She was struggling. At one time, Mom mentioned that all she remembered of her mom while she was alive was being with her while she was cleaning a movie theater. There was no safety net then, only family, and there weren't a lot of resources to go around there. So Mike came back, and unsurprisingly, Minnie got pregnant. Mike's condition deteriorated, and Minnie, already struggling, decided to get a backroom abortion. It was botched, and she died of hemorrhaging. This made Mom a lifelong supporter of abortion rights when it came to be an issue. Although an interesting thing, I didn't write this in there, but I was thinking it, is our next door neighbor, the La Rivieres, when we were the first house on Davison, not the one she lived in for the last 50 years, were staunchly anti-abortion, but Mom and Laura were just very close friends. I guess it was a different time and different people, but I think there was an agreement to disagree, or perhaps Mom just didn't say anything. I think that's a possibility too. Anyway, she remembered her mom laid out and the other women wailing. Mike died of tuberculosis later that year. So at 6 for her and 8 for her brother, they were orphaned. They were separated, and Bill went to live with Hoodle, which is another story. That's an interesting story, but we'll leave that for another time. Mom went to live with her aunt, Rose, and Rose's husband, David Bloom, in Hibbing on the Iron Range. There, she became fast and lifelong friends with their kids, her first cousins, Ted and Phil. After a year, she went to live with her great-aunt, Rose Levant. Mom grew up there. There were challenges. She was once playing with a dollhouse in candles, and her clothing caught fire, burning her arm. She had a scar that she still had until present time. She also had appendicitis, and her appendix burst, which at that time, prior to antibiotics, was often a death sentence. But she survived and thrived, making close friends and graduating from Eveleth High School. She went to Eveleth Junior College, just by the way, Lucille Mattis. Did you see that in her obituary? They were a few years off, but did not graduate, just like Lucille Mattis. She worked in her second cousin Morris Greenberg's law office and enjoyed typing so much that she would retype articles when she wasn't busy. She learned shorthand in high school. I asked her, did you learn it in junior college? She said, no, I learned it in high school. According to her application to work at DuPont when she moved here, she also worked at Eveleth Savings and Loan. Now I'm going to wing it a little here. So she lost her family, but she became part of a really large extended family. There were many, many kids and grandkids and probably great-grandkids and things. And, she had stories of living there and, cooking and probably making sauerkraut or I don't know what. But there's one story that I just kind of thought, and I have to tell, and that's she hated rutabagas. She did not like rutabagas. And her aunt, actually this is one thing she learned from her aunt, is aunt made these, well, I never had her great aunt's Cornish pasties, but I had my mom's, and they were really, really good. Very good. They were very good. At any rate, so they were having dinner one time, and Mom starts diving into her pasty, and it's like all rutabagas. They played a joke on her. You can just see, you can see her because how she was. I mean, she was always very focused on things, and I think she was pretty dismayed.
She used to pick out the rutabagas.
Oh, okay.
From the pasties.
Yeah.
She didn't like them.
Yeah.
So she started picking out the rutabagas.
Oh, okay. Did you hear that? See, I got it wrong. She used to pick out the rutabagas, and so she got this one that was just completely rutabagas, and she started picking them all out. And Nothing left, yeah. So I shouldn't wing it, but anyway. When Mom was grown, she asked her auntie why she took her in and put up with her. As hard as it is to believe, she was kind of wild back then. I mean, you can believe it because, orphan, stuff like that, but given what you know about her now, Doris, wild? And her auntie replied, "What could I do? You were all alone." This is the part I was shook up at. Mom stayed in Eveleth until her auntie died, after which she moved to Minneapolis. Mom, still in her room, has a picture of Rose in a polka dot dress that she gave her, and she remembered the dress and what color it was. She really loved her great aunt. In Minneapolis, she roomed with friends, including Judy Porter and two sisters. She told me their name a few weeks ago. We're just chatting at the rehab, and she's like, "Oh, it was the so-and-so sisters." And I thought it sounded Jewish, like a Jewish name, but I forgot it. So I went back and found the census, and there were two sisters there, but it was not a Jewish name. So I don't know. I'm not sure if that was them. Anyway, Dorothy's mom provided room and board. She worked at several jobs in Minneapolis and was employed throughout the Great Depression. She and her friends went on road trips, and Judy in particular remained a lifelong friend. Around 1934, she went to the wedding of her great-aunt's grandson, Morris Greenberg, the one I mentioned before, to Raina Lewis. At the wedding, Mom met Walt Lewis, Raina's younger brother. Legend has it that Walt was struck with Mom. He pursued her. However, she was ever practical and wasn't about to marry someone without a stable job and income. He bounced around to various jobs and at the time was working delivery for his brother-in-law, Louis Roth, driving around the Iron Range in Minnesota, supplying taverns and shops with tobacco and candy. Another legendary story was when they were meeting for a New Year's Eve party, probably that same year, and Walt had to finish his deliveries in the middle of the winter in northeast Minnesota. Needless to say, he was late, though I think he made it before midnight. I asked her, and she wasn't totally sure. Mom was probably mad, although, the first blush of love, who knows. The first of many times, probably though, that was the first of many times. "Hurry up, Walt." That was a pretty common sentiment on her part. Fast forward to the 1940s, and after a couple years learning and teaching photography for the Army Air Corps, Dad got out and went to work at Hanford as a patrol photographer in 1943. In 1944, Mom agreed to marry him. This appeared to be a stable job with good pay, and so, okay, let's go. Came out in December, and when they were married in Seattle, and followed that with their honeymoon in Vancouver, BC. Mom settled into her domestic life in a one-bedroom prefab. However, not having cooked much before, she set to learning how to do that. She was generally successful, although baking potatoes for the first time resulted in explosions, as she didn't know to poke holes in them to let the steam out. After a few months of domestic bliss, Mom heard that DuPont was in dire need of secretaries, and she applied. She got the job and then transitioned to General Electric, working for Charlie Gross at one point, and ended up at Battelle working for Ernie Galbraith. I believe she was in human resources most of that time, or personnel as they called it then. She was, as you might think, very competent, I might imagine. I did a Freedom of Information request, and one of her evaluations, I haven't read the whole thing, it's like 350 pages. One of her evaluations said that she got too stressed about small errors. Back in the day, she was clocked at 120 words per minute typing on a Selectric. She had one in the basement and was typing letters till at least 2012. So she would have been 98 in 2012. I found one that she typed then. Within a few years, though, I think her fingers weren't cooperating and her composition skills had declined. In 1950, Mom was a founder of the Richland Jewish Congregation. She's the last, I believe she's the last founder. She was the last living founder, which later became Congregation Beth Shalom. I thought it would be so cool for her to be here for the 70th anniversary next year, but unfortunately, that won't be. The congregation was a big part of her life, and like many of her generation, she felt an obligation to be part of and support the Jewish community. She made many fast and long friendships in the sisterhood in particular. I almost forgot to include two events that were central to Mom's life. What's that? Yeah, the arrival of Miriam and me. It's like I got through this all. It's like, oh, I guess maybe I should have included that. That's kind of important. By 1954, after 10 years of marriage, they'd given up on the idea of kids, having kids. Mom had even given her ring to her, that had come from her mom, I think, to her niece, Merle. But surprise! I was born in 1955, just days after she turned 41, and Miriam was born 3.5 years later. You know, if they'd had us at the typical time, so when she was 20, I could have been living in Bonaventure with her, you know? After, she'd say, I'd say, okay, Mom, I gotta go now. She'd say, don't go. I say, okay, well, you want me to move in? No, I could sleep on the couch. She'd go, no. She just didn't want me to go. After she retired in 1979, she went back to work temping for the top management at Battelle, including Bill Wiley and others I don't know. She continued to work until her early 80s. As time went on, though, her jobs and pay diminished, especially as word processors and computers came in. She never really got the hang of them, although Ron did say that she was using the word processor, so maybe the word processor she was okay with. I remember on one of her last jobs was filing, and I remember her coming home and telling me, I was living back here in Richland at the time with her, telling me that no one there knows how to file, which is probably true. That's why they hired her. Mom loved to travel. When I went to Europe and Paris in 1981, I left in October, and at that time, she knew that she had a colon tumor and was going to get an operation, but she didn't tell me, which kind of pissed me off, actually, because as a young woman, she'd wished to go to Europe and wasn't able to, and she didn't want to spoil the trip. Another parenthetical note is, so I called up, on Thanksgiving, and I called up the Blooms in Portland, because usually we went to the Blooms for Thanksgiving. I'm like, so here I am in the central office, post office in Paris, feeding francs into the phone, and I didn't have very many, and at like 2 a.m. or something, I don't remember exactly. It was pretty early, in the middle of the night, and I'm like, so I reached the Blooms. I don't know if it was Leslie or Linda answered the phone. They go, "Oh, Jerry, don't worry, your mom's out of the hospital." I'm like, what? And then the money ran out. There's actually a long story to that. We'll skip that, the rest of that story. For a number of summers, she, Norma Blazewicz, Paula Garland, and I think Rhoda Berg also, would go to Palm Springs in the winter. She took a number of tours, including a Europe tour where she spent a week with Walt's niece, Rachel Roth, who was flat-sitting in London, and Dad ended up locking the keys in the flat. That's another story. She went to Russia with Paula, Israel with the Catherines and others, and other tours too. Her last big tour with Paula started the day after Sam, her first grandchild, was born. She felt guilty leaving, but at least she got to hold him before she went. Okay, I'm almost done. One more page. although in the last couple of years, she didn't feel up to traveling, we did take her to the bar mitzvah of the grandson of her niece in Los Angeles. It was a little difficult, but she enjoyed seeing family, and they loved seeing her. Merle sent us a picture of her, and she's just like beaming, her smiles like all the way across her face practically. She also came to Portland with us to see Woodstock or Bust. Was that earlier this year? Earlier this year? Last November? Okay. Which we have the director of sitting in the front row here. A preview showing of a film by our cousin Leslie Bloom. The last chapter of her life was at Bonaventure. At first, she hated it. I mean, she hated it. She said, this is a sad end, and ignored me when I said to think of it as an adventure. It's unnatural. They are all so old here. Never mind that she was one of the oldest. It's like a sea of white hair, and they all look alike. After a while, she still hated it, but as time went on, she saw its benefit and hated it less actively. She made some friends there, as well as she knew some people there from before. Rhoda Berg was there, for quite a while. She even almost had a boyfriend, maybe had a boyfriend. I used to tease her about that. But she would say, they're acquaintances. All my friends are dead. I would point out this wasn't true, but I don't think it changed her mind at all. So I've probably gone on too long, and even at that, I've left out really many interesting details and stories. But I'd like to say in closing that especially in her hundreds, she became a bit like a rock star. She spoke her mind more freely than when she was younger, so you knew what she wanted, or more forcefully, what she didn't want. You definitely knew what she didn't want. Everywhere she went, people were amazed at her spunk and her sharpness. The nurses and the doctors in the hospital loved her and were amazed. She was a legend at Bonaventure. She was a legend. She is a legend. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you very much for being here. I'd like to be able to give a complete picture of my mother and the amazing person she was, but what I know most about her is who she was with me and our family, and how much she did for me and all of us. And when I say all of us, I'm talking, about Jerry and me and our families and all of you who are here, and many of you who are not here. Hopefully we'll see all of you sometime soon. So I can really only talk about Mom in relation to us, Jerry, my dad, and our other family, and other close friends and families. When I asked her, she didn't like to talk about herself, so there are pieces missing. But what I do know is how she was with me and our family, and what she did for me and for Jerry and all of us. When I think about Mom, what I think about are her qualities as a person. Children learn so much from what their parents do and from who they are, which has me kind of worried personally, but sorry, Pan. And I learned from Mom and also from my father what a good person truly is. Mom was honest as the day is long, maybe longer. She was easily the most honest and straightforward person I've ever known in my life. While she may have kept things to herself, she never, to my knowledge, ever said anything untrue. Growing up, I didn't really realize that this was unusual, but now I know how special she was. Both she and Dad were models of integrity for me, and I confess that I gravitate in my life towards people like this, and I'm still really thrown by those who say one thing and mean another. Sometimes this honesty could cause painful clashes in both directions, as I could only lie by omission or by very, very careful planning. But I'm so thankful for this gift of true integrity. It's not met with so frequently in the world, and I value it highly, and I had the best model for it in really both of my parents. She worked hard all of her life until almost the very end. Although because of her abilities and intelligence, and she didn't value her own intelligence, I don't think she thought of herself as really smart, but she was. Her teachers at junior college wanted her to continue to university, but she didn't want to be beholden, presumably, to her Auntie Rose Levant, who raised her, so she didn't continue her education, and she went off to work. She worked hard, both professionally at home and as a volunteer thereafter. As a parent with 2 working adults in the home and only 1 kid, I really don't know how she did it. I mean, I just don't. Our home was always clean and organized. She cooked dinner every night and kept everything together. She wasn't without help because Dad retired when I was 10. He was 10 years older than she was, 10 or 11, I can't remember. Yeah, I guess 11. And we had an after-school babysitter before that. But, you know, she did so much work to keep us all organized and together. And, you know, one thing I remember, just an anecdote, is that she always used to make Dad's bed as well as her own. Thanks, Mom. I'm a bad sleeper, too. Because Dad had to make his own bed when he was in the Army, and he didn't want to anymore. And I always wondered, when was Mom going to get out of the Army? Mom worked full-time from the time I was about 7. She'd taken off when Jerry was born, and then she worked part-time, and then when I was born, she took off again and then went back to work. And by the way, Jerry said he was a real surprise because the doctor had said, oh, you're not going to have children. And then after Jerry was born, the doctor said, you're not going to have any more children. So I was a surprise, too. So she worked full-time from the time I was about 7, but was also active in the sisterhood and other synagogue activities. But she also found time to help Jerry and me with our schoolwork and activities. And I say again, I do not know how she did this. She just seemed to manage to be able to do everything. So I don't know if you all know this in the ways that you knew Mom, but she was not really a relaxed person. She was a big worrier and a little bit on the uptight side. Jerry and I have talked a lot about this, and I think that this is probably related to her childhood and the loss of her parents at such a young age. It's like, I think that gives a person a lifelong feeling of what's going to happen next. And also, we think that she probably blocked out a lot of memories, and that leaves a person with an unconscious feeling of that. But this tendency to worry didn't make her less fun to be around. Jerry has called her the most cheerful pessimist, and I'd say that this fits. During our childhood, her worrying didn't keep her from making fun birthdays for us, having fun family outings, and a lot of get-togethers with friends. We used to do a lot of get-togethers with the Knudsens, who I don't think we're so much in touch anymore, but we have a lot of great pictures from those. And what was the name? Oh, the Johnsons, that other family we used to get together with. When we were older, I know we gave her legitimate things to worry about. In my case, running around pretty wild, not paying too much attention in school, a run of horrendous boyfriends, and drifting through jobs rather than pursuing a career, which, thanks, Dad, I was also a late bloomer. Still, her worry was out of proportion to what was going on, although as a parent myself, I understand it better now. As our life settled down, she transferred her worrying talents to our children, and only in her very last years did she abandon that skill and let her worries fall away. And really, maybe only in the last 2 years. Mom set very high standards for herself. She was always well-groomed and had fantastic taste in clothes. As I mentioned before, the house was always tidy, except for Jerry's and my room, which she tried to stem the tide, but it was just not successful. Her use of language was precise and educated. It was natural for her to impart, or try to impart, those standards to us with varying degrees of success. Well, in junior high and high school, I wore a lot of makeup. After that, I pretty much stopped using it. Every time I'd visit, Mom would say, "I like you better with lipstick on." I'd say, "No, you like the way I look better with lipstick on." Mom would say, "No, I like you better with lipstick on." So, Mom, for you today, I have lipstick on. She was nothing if not consistent in her opinions. In addition, she corrected our grammar, pronunciation, and so forth, and when asked for word definitions, sent us to the dictionary, engendering in us, or me at least, a lifelong love of big words and eccentric illustrations. She also taught me how to shop and transferred her excellent taste to me, although you can't necessarily tell by how I dress. I'm a costume designer, so I have diplomatic immunity. She was generous. She was generous with her time, with her money, with her love. When I think back, she must have had so many demands on her time, yet she found time to make cookies, cupcakes, and other baked goods for our school events, time to host my Campfire Girl meetings, time to teach me to bake, time to help so many other people, and to spend time with her close friends, among them Iris Ufkus, Bonnie Goldsmith, Susan Catherine, Paula Garland, and others that I know I'm forgetting, and family, Ted and Loretta Bloom, Merle Minda and Nancy Paull, my uncle Bill Paull and Aunt Helen, my dad's 3 sisters who used to come out and visit, Aunt Ruth, Aunt Raina, and Aunt Wynne, and many others that I know I'm leaving out. She donated money to many causes, Jewish and otherwise, especially in the arts. Although she didn't consider herself artistic, everybody else in the family had artistic interests. And, as in everything else, she supported the people to whom she was close. She also loaned or gave money to family and close family friends who needed a boost. And she never stinted her love. To us, to the family, close and extended, and to a wide range of surrogate children for whom she was Auntie Doris. In addition to working hard and keeping us all together, Mom found time to keep aware of current events and cultivate a keen, if not somewhat biting and sarcastic, but never cruel, sense of humor. About 15 years back, she came down to San Francisco for Thanksgiving, and I wasn't really surprised to find, as we were discussing current world events, that she knew more than I did about some of them. We used to frequently discuss politics, and indeed, Mom was a card-carrying member of the ACLU. Jerry and I used to accompany Mom and Dad to the voting booth when we were little, and that's a tradition that I carried on with Pan. So, Mom didn't use much in the way of colorful language when we were young, although I've been told that when I was little, she dropped something on the kitchen floor and it broke, and after that, I went up to my dad and said, "Daddy, what does son of a fish mean?" In later years, she added a few more specimens to her vocabulary. On one visit, Jerry and I were walking with Mom down by the river, and Jerry, as usual, made some wisecrack. Mom put her arm around him and said lovingly, "You sarcastic little shit." Just then, a lady approaching us, but not hearing us, said, "Isn't that sweet?" That's us in a nutshell, the sarcastic family. Time spent with her was always so enjoyable. After the contentious struggles of my teenage and young adult years. This is something I understand now to be a great, great gift, as I see how many daughters have difficult or estranged relationships with their mothers. Even when we were fighting or at odds about my horrible boyfriend's hippie college, unacceptable clothes, that pink satin halter top that got me sent home from school, I think that was the last thing she forgot. I always knew it came up every time. She remembered it for over 50 years. I said, Mom, it's over. I always knew how much Mom loved me. Once those years were over, the contentious ones, Mom and I have been close ever since, and we're better than friends to each other, or so it feels to me. There has never been anybody who has or will love me more or better than my mother.
Thank you, Jerry and Miriam. I'd like to add a few words. My family has been very close with the Lewis family. In fact, Walt was my son's godfather, and this kippah that I'm wearing was a gift from Walt, and I wear it in his memory and in Doris's memory today. But I wanted to just mention 2 or 3 quick items. One is, one of the first times I ever met Doris, I had started work at Patel. My department manager's office was above her manager's office, above Ernie Galbraith's office. Every week our department would have a staff meeting, and the various section managers would get together and discuss problems of the day, most of which were because of the doggone personnel department not letting us do what we wanted to do and raise pay and all kinds of things. And this was an old government building, and it usually was a rather rowdy meeting that we had, and we ended up stomping on the floor and what have you. One day, Doris knocked on the door during the midst of our staff meeting, and she said, "What are you guys doing up here? Your building's gonna fall down." Later on, she collared me out in the hall and said, "Would you please tell me what you guys do up there?" Well, I really couldn't, but that was kind of my introduction. I would occasionally, over the years, particularly later years, drop by her house just if I was leaving, because it was typically on my way. And I'd sit and we'd enjoy a cup of coffee, and I would sometimes see her go down the rickety stairway carrying a basket of laundry, and I was just kind of hoping nothing would happen. She never fell, she never even slipped. It was amazing. But for about 3 decades, I teased her about her drinking habits. Of course, she didn't drink. That's beside the point. And that came about one day when I was visiting, and we were enjoying a cup of coffee together, the two of us. And at that time, I used to take milk in my coffee, and I said, "Doris, I need some milk." We were in the kitchen, and she said, "Well, get up and get it." So I got up, and I opened the refrigerator, and here were not 1, but 2 half-empty bottles of wine. And that was the start. Jerry and Miriam should know. That was the start of all of this. And she would respond always to my kidding with a, yeah. Finally, I mentioned the fact that she liked to travel. Now, she did travel with my wife, and one year they put together a meeting, or a travel visit to Europe. One of the places they visited was Copenhagen in Denmark. Copenhagen has a reputation as a city of licentiousness, perhaps. Anyway, when they arrived, they checked into their hotel, and they found it was in the right smack dab in the middle of the red light district. I never did find out how much money they made. But they were rather nonplussed, because in Copenhagen, the ladies of the evening advertised their wares by sitting in the windows of their rooms, scantily clad. And I think that was a great conversation piece. centerpiece for a long time. Now, did you, Doug Mandel, wanted to say a few words, and then we will proceed. Go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, I'm going to read a message that we received from Merle Minda, who was Doris's oldest niece. And this is what she wrote. My father, Bill, was 2 years older than his little sister, Doris. Their childhood was abruptly altered when both their parents tragically died within 1 year when Doris was 6. They were separated, sent off to relatives. Doris away from Duluth, and she never really reconnected with her brother much over the years. Doris told me many times that when her brother Billy married my mother, it was my mom who welcomed her and brought her into the family. And my grandmother welcomed her as another daughter as well. It was love all around. Doris finally had the primary family she needed. When the babies came, my grandmother packed up her favorite pots and pans and left for Richland. Both times, Doris and Billy became very close too. Both she and Walter were kindly instrumental in his well-being after he suffered a stroke at a young age. He came out here to Richland to stay for many summers, gardening and canoodling with Walter too. Meanwhile, Doris was a tremendous force within our family, gracious and charming, so sharp, working for years at the plant, indispensable. They kept using her into her 80s, I think. Although I am 25 years younger because she had children later and I had them early, our children and then later our grandchildren were much the same age. More bonding for me with Doris. When she and the family came to Duluth, we prepared for weeks, agog with excitement. I remember those summer arrivals and long stays so well as highlights of my life. She was tiny, adorable, so thoughtful, and so wildly bright. Part of my life as long as I can remember. We had so many long, serious talks together. I never tired of being with her. I could ask her anything. I could count on her love for me. Now that she is gone, I am the oldest living member of my original family. A few years ago, I stayed with her at her assisted living place. She would knock on my door at 7:30 a.m. for breakfast. I would walk with her around the outside of the building. She was faster. Our last visit together, and I treasure it. I brought her a top from Paris that she loved wearing. Her departure leaves a scar in my heart that will never heal. But I feel so lucky for having her in my life for so long. Fabulous, beautiful Doris.
Thank you, Doug. Would you please join me in the recitation of Psalm 23? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He guideth me in straight paths for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou hast anointed my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Earlier I mentioned there are two requisite prayers. The first of these, at the conclusion of the service, the first of these two traditionally required prayers is a prayer for the soul of the departed, which I shall read to you in English. O God, full of compassion, thou who dwellest on high, grant perfect rest beneath the shelter of thy divine presence among the holy and pure, who shine as the brightness of the firmament to the soul of our beloved, who is gone to her eternal home. May thou, O God, filled with mercy, shelter her forever under the wings of thy presence. May her soul be bound up in the bond of life eternal, and grant that memories of Doris Lewis inspire us all to noble and consecrated living. The service will conclude with a brief graveside service, and if you would all assemble down at the gravesite, go out the door, turn right, follow the path, and you'll come to it. And if the pallbearers, please, would come forward. And I'll see you all down at the gravesite.